Hey, listen. For almost 30 years, and during the height of the Cold War, secrets had moved from Norway to the Soviet Union. But on a cold winter morning in 1977, it was about to stop. A woman in her 60s stepped off the tram in Oslo, the capital of Norway, and she was about to meet a Soviet KGB agent to deliver new information. But this morning, the Norwegian Police Security Services was watching her every move. And after she met the KGB officer, the plot was over and the police arrested her. And eventually she told them everything. It was the end of her secret life that had lasted for almost 30 years. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you one of the most infamous spy stories from Norway. The story of Gunvor Galtung Haavik. Today we often think about Norway as peaceful, stable and wealthy. But after the Second World War ended, Norway was still recovering from over 5 years of German occupation. Then in 1949, Norway was one of the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. Norway was now part of the Western Alliance, standing together with countries like Britain and the United States. But what separated Norway from those countries was that Norway shared a common border with the Soviet Union far up in the north. And the Soviet Union had enormous military interests in the north, especially around the Kola Peninsula, where their northern fleet had their headquarters. And this reality shaped much of Norway's foreign policy during the Cold War and laid the groundworks for the story of Gunvor. Gunvor was born in Oslo in 1912. She came from an educated family and began studying medicine before she eventually moved on to becoming a nurse. Then, after the invasion of Norway during the Second World War, Gunvor started to work at a hospital in Bodø, a relatively small town in the northern parts of Norway, which also happens to be my hometown. Bodø was hit by one of the most destructive bombings by the Luftwaffe during the entire Norwegian campaign. In May of 1940, the Luftwaffe dropped around 70 tons of bombs on the city, completely devastating it. You see, northern Norway was a strategically important area for the Germans during the war. It secured Germany access to the ice-free port of Narvik, which supplied the Nazi effort with Swedish iron ore. In addition to this, the long Norwegian coastline provided Germany with naval and air bases along the North Atlantic so they could easier strike the Arctic convoy routes used by the Allies. And so, because of this, northern Norway was full of German military activity during the war. And the Germans also brought a huge number of Soviet prisoners of war to Norway. The prisoners were used as forced labor. They built roads, railways, military sites and fortifications along the Norwegian coast under terrible conditions. And thousands of them would die from hunger, disease, cold or exhaustion. Many Norwegians saw these prisoners under close guard by the Germans, but Gunvor, she met some of them as patients while she was working at the hospital in Bodø. And Gunvor had a unique skill that few other Norwegians had at the time. She was able to speak Russian. Before the war, she had been taught the language by a Russian artist living in Norway by the name of Valeri Karrik. Now, Karrik doesn't sound very Russian, and that's because his grandparents moved to Leningrad in the early 1800s. It's also believed that during these language lessons, Gunvor developed a special interest in Russian politics, society and culture. So when Gunvor was treating these Russian prisoners of war, she was able to speak to them in their own language. That must have been comforting in one way or another. And one of the prisoners she treated was a man named Vladimir Koslov. And just like her tutor, he was also from the city of Leningrad. He had been forced to work at a fish processing plant in Bodø before ending up at the hospital where Gunvor worked. Gunvor and Vladimir began talking to each other. At first it may have been just simple conversations between a nurse and her patient, but gradually something more romantic and personal developed between them. And at some point during his recovery at the hospital, Gunvor would help Vladimir escape. But before he fled, he gave her his address in Leningrad in hopes of seeing each other again. After the war, Gunvor began work as an interpreter, and especially in connection with the Soviet prisoners of war and the difficult aftermath of the war. From there, she was soon hired by the Norwegian Foreign Service, and in 1947 she was sent to work at the embassy in Moscow. For Gunvor, this finally gave her a chance to meet the man she fell in love with during the war. And so one day, she left her station in Moscow and went to Leningrad to try and find Vladimir. And she found him, still living at the same address he had given her so many years before. But the reunion did not go as planned. Vladimir had moved on and established a family of his own. Despite this, Gunvor wanted to remain in contact with Vladimir, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for her life. Eventually, the KGB found out that Vladimir was having a relationship with Gunvor, an employee from the Norwegian embassy having an affair with a Soviet citizen. This, of course, was a unique opportunity for the KGB to try and recruit her. After some time of cultivation, Gunvor was finally presented with a document and forced to sign it. And so, in 1950, Gunvor was recruited by the KGB. And once you've taken that step, getting out is nearly impossible.
No one ever leaves the KGB.
Gunvor worked at the Norwegian embassy in Moscow from 1947 to the mid-1950s. And during those years, she's believed to have had over 80 meetings with the KGB. But after Gunvor returns to Norway, that's where this case becomes hard to understand. If she had only spied in Moscow, we might see her as someone trapped by Soviet pressure. But when she returned to Norway, she continued spying for the KGB. And Gunvor's greatest cover was that she was just so normal. She was educated, polite, unmarried, and reliable. She was a hard worker, people knew her, and because they knew her, they had no reason to be suspicious. What they didn't know was that Gunvor reportedly had a very special handbag with a secret compartment in it. She would use this hidden compartment to carry copied documents out of the office and give them to her handlers. And this would go on for decades. Then suddenly, it looked like the net was closing in. In the mid-1960s, a Soviet KGB officer by the name of Anatoly Golitsyn had defected to the United States and started sharing information with the FBI about what he knew. And one of the things he revealed was deeply alarming for Norway. He told them about this Norwegian woman in Russia that had been recruited by the KGB, and she worked at the Norwegian embassy in Moscow. So when the Norwegian authorities got this information from the FBI, you would think the trail would lead to Gunvor. But it didn't. Instead, when Gunvor went back to Norway, she was replaced by another woman, and her name was Ingeborg Lygren. And because Golitsyn sat on old information, the Norwegian secret police in 1965 thought that the woman he was talking about was Lygren. And so, she was arrested, accused of being a Soviet spy. Eventually, because they had no evidence linking Lygren to being a Soviet spy, she was set free. But trust me, just being accused of being a Soviet spy during the height of the Cold War, your life will never be the same again. And so, while Ingeborg Lygren was carrying the damage of that accusation, Gunvor continued her work as a Soviet spy in Norway. Eventually, or should I say finally, the surveillance around the Soviet contacts in Norway began pointing towards Gunvor. In 1974, she was observed together with a suspected KGB officer in Oslo. From there, the pieces began to fit together. Her Moscow past, her long career in the foreign ministry, the old information about a female Soviet source, and the earlier mistake with Lygren. And so now the police had a theory, but they needed to prove it. So they started to watch her every move, and then they waited. In January 1977, Gunvor took the tram in Oslo and got off near Bråten on the Ekeberg line. And there she met a man named Alexander Principalov. He worked at the Soviet embassy. This confirmed the suspicion the police had, so they moved in. And while Principalov protested and resisted, Gunvor did not. After almost 30 years, her secret life was finally over. At first, Gunvor tried to explain the meeting by talking about Vladimir. She claimed that the Soviet contact, Principalov, had helped her exchange love letters between her and Vladimir. But the explanation just didn't hold. And when pressed, Gunvor finally admitted that she had been working for the KGB for almost 30 years. For Norway, this came as a complete shock. A trusted employee in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been a long-term KGB agent. And there were so many questions. What had she given the Soviets? How much damage had she done? How could she go on for so long without being noticed? And how did the wrong woman end up accused? A trial might have answered all these questions, but that was not to be. Gunvor was held in Drammen prison while waiting for the case to move forward, and the trial was supposed to begin later in 1977. But in early August of that year, Gunvor died in prison of heart failure. For me, one of the biggest questions about this case is Gunvor's motives. Was she just this vulnerable woman who had been taken advantage of by the KGB? Or was she simply a traitor who used love as an excuse? Or maybe a bit of both? Even though Lygren, the other woman, was cleared of any suspicion, it took over 10 years before people understood that Haavik was the real spy. And at this point her entire life was forever changed by this mix-up. The case also had major institutional consequences in Norway. Both intelligence chief Wilhelm Evang and surveillance police chief Asbjørn Bryn were pushed out or moved from their positions in the aftermath of the Lygren affair. And the scandal contributed to scrutiny of Norway's secret services. But at least they finally got her. I hope you enjoyed this spy episode from the north. Until next time, remember, history is closer than you think.